Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. Today I have a few different holsters that I want to make out of leather. Actually, this is not the first video I've done on the subject. One of the first videos I ever posted on YouTube was a demonstration of my approach to making a leather holster. And my approach to making leather holsters really hasn't changed much since then. However, I like to think that my presentation skills have improved a bit over the years, and so I'm making this video as a new overview of the same process. To begin with, I wrap some scratch paper around the gun and trim the paper to the shape of a mock holster. This allows me to develop the holster pattern by trial and error without wasting precious leather. Most of the holsters I make follow one of three basic patterns. There is the drop loop tie-down holster, where the body of the holster hangs below the belt loop, and a secondary loop is provided at the bottom end of the holster to accommodate a tie-down strap. Then there's the typical modern holster, where the belt loop is on the back of the holster. And there's the inside the waistband appendix holster, which actually follows a similar pattern to the drop loop holster, except that the belt loop is on the opposite side and gets folded down against the body of the holster so that the holster can ride inside your pants with the belt loop folded over on top of your pants for your belt to pass through. I use a variety of retention methods. I often integrate a leather strap into the holster that will hold the gun in place and will be fastened with a snap. However, for a drop loop holster that will carry a single-action revolver, another option is just to punch a couple holes in the holster body and use a traditional leather thong for retention. In the case of an appendix holster, the pressure exerted by your waistband is usually sufficient to ensure a friction fit, making a separate retention feature unnecessary as long as you're not planning on doing any serious acrobatics while wearing the holster. Anyway, after I've made the paper pattern, I lay it on the leather and trace around it with a marker. I use full-grain veg-tanned leather for all my holsters, mostly cowhide because it's more readily available, but horsehide works even better if you can get it. I like to use relatively thick leather, typically 10 to 12 ounce, which is just under 3/16 of an inch thick. When you're tracing the pattern, be careful about which way you lay the pattern on the leather, because if you accidentally flip it over, you'll end up with a holster that either has the wrong side of leather facing outward or else is made for the wrong hand. For example, maybe you intended to make a right-handed holster, but you end up with a left-handed one. When I'm tracing the pattern, I also like to add a little bit of margin around the edges. If your paper pattern is perfect, then this isn't necessary. But if it turns out you have to make any minor adjustments to mold the leather into the final shape, then this gives you a little extra material to accommodate those adjustments. If you cut the leather a little large, it's easy to trim a little material off the edges later. But if you cut it too small, then you may have to start over from scratch, which wastes a lot of leather as well as time. Once the leather pattern has been cut out, I soak it in warm water until it stops bubbling, which can take 3 to 5 minutes. This renders the leather soft and pliable, so I can mold it around the gun and form it into the shape of the holster that I want. Contact with wet leather can cause corrosion on metal parts, so I use a couple different methods to protect the gun while I'm molding the leather around it. Usually, for the initial molding, I just wipe the gun with some WD-40 or other water-displacing oil. Sometimes, if I'm going to leave the gun in the wet holster for a while, I will cover it with a very thin sheet of flexible plastic, such as a plastic shopping bag. As I mold the holster into its final shape, I use blind rivets, sometimes known as pop rivets, to hold it together. Sometimes people ask me why I use pop rivets as opposed to other types of rivets or stitching. The answer is simply that this is a method I'm familiar with that's pretty simple to do and provides a strong, durable connection. Maybe there are other methods that work just as well or even better, but this is the one I'm familiar with, so it's the one I use and it's the one I can personally vouch for. Of course, because leather is a relatively soft material, I need to use a backing washer with each rivet. I like to use all stainless rivets and washers if possible, but in a dry climate like Idaho, I've also gotten away with using plain galvanized steel rivets and never actually had a problem with them ever rusting out. Blind rivets are initially set with a riveting tool that pulls on the shank, expanding the opposite side of the rivet head until the shank breaks and the enlarged head on the back side of the rivet pops off, hence the name pop rivets. After setting the rivets with the riveting tool, I like to clean up the back side of each rivet a little bit. This isn't necessary as far as the holding strength of the rivet is concerned, but it will make them look better and give them a lower profile that's less likely to snag on anything. To do this, first I look to see if the shank head is still lodged inside the rivet, and use a small nail to punch it out if it is. Then I use a 60-degree punch to flare the back end of the rivet a bit, followed by a 120-degree punch to widen the flare, and finally I pound it flat with a ball-peen hammer. Once the holster is all riveted together, I finish any final shaping and then leave it overnight with the gun in it to ensure that it maintains its shape. By the next day, the leather will generally have dried enough that it won't deform under its own weight, so I can take the gun out and let the holster sit for a couple more days to dry completely. Next comes the optional step of dyeing the leather. There are basically 3 types of leather dye. Oil-based leather dyes tend to give the most uniform and durable coloration and are my preferred method of dyeing leather. Penetrating alcohol-based leather dyes also produce a good durable color and can be applied when the leather is still damp, although I've never really found that to be much of an advantage. Finally, shoe polish type leather dyes are usually alcohol-based but tend to be less concentrated and have a more superficial, less penetrating pigment. In general, I do not recommend the use of shoe polish type leather dyes, but in this case I have a bottle of the shoe polish stuff that I'm trying to use up, and the holsters I was dyeing here were mostly for concealed carry anyway, so it doesn't matter what they look like if no one's ever going to see them anyway, right? In any case, to dye a holster, just moisten a rag or cotton ball or other applicator with the dye and wipe it on the leather. Some dyes will come with a cotton, wool, or foam applicator, either built into the bottle cap or packaged with the bottle for your convenience. Whether you dye the leather or not, the final step after the holster is fully dry is to oil it. This helps to preserve the leather and makes it more resistant to moisture and eventual cracking from cyclical drying. Ideally, leather holsters should be periodically re-oiled to extend their service life, although I'm not sure what frequency of re-oiling is really required. After making a holster and oiling it well to begin with, I've sometimes worn it for the better part of a decade without re-oiling and without noticing any degradation of the leather. However, in a wetter climate, maybe this would be a more significant issue. As far as what oil to use, neat's foot oil is specially formulated and marketed as a leather preservative and seems to work well. Sometimes I've also used WD-40 or canola oil, and while these are better than nothing, their preservative effects seem to wear off faster. Motor oil seems to work okay, but has a rather strong odor, at least compared to neat's foot oil. I've sometimes wondered if penetrating oil wood finishes, like linseed oil, would work on leather, but I haven't gotten around to trying them. I'm a little concerned that they might cause the leather to become brittle, but without trying them, it's hard to say for sure. Once you've oiled the holster, it should be ready for service, so until next time, thanks for watching the Idahoan Show.